Greetings, students. Let's look at the U.S. return to isolationism after World War I, our old standby foreign policy in the United States. It's U.S. isolationism that allows Germany to rise. Hitler creates a totalitarian dictatorship undergirded with extreme racism in Germany, and Hitler pulls Germany out of the League of Nations. They reoccupy a part of Germany on the border with France that they were not supposed to have any soldiers in, the Rhineland. And Hitler comes out and publicly denounces the Treaty of Versailles. Basically says he's not going to follow it anymore, he's going to ignore it. And later, Germany adds Austria without any opposition, and then gains Czechoslovakia with what's called the Munich Pact, an agreement between Germany, Britain, and France. And this is the leader of Britain at the time, Lord Chamberlain, shaking hands with Nazi leaders, including Hitler there on the right. Britain and France were so damaged mentally, psychologically, physically, economically, culturally, from World War I, that by the mid-1930s, they're not ready to go to war again. They use the strategy of appeasement, giving in to an aggressor to maintain peace, to avoid going to another war in the early 1930s. However, Chamberlain returned from the Munich Pact agreement and immediately ordered that factories in Britain begin producing more and more airplanes to fight the Nazis eventually. So you can look at it another way in that Chamberlain, France, and Britain were buying time and making sure they would eventually be ready to fight Hitler. In Italy, Benito Mussolini takes over and creates a fascist government. It's very similar to the government in Germany. It lacks some of the racism, but it is still a totalitarian state with limits on people's rights, extreme nationalism, a belief in military power, and Italy invades the African nation of Ethiopia. Ethiopia goes before the League of Nations and requests support, requests assistance from the League of Nations, and the League does nothing. This is the biggest failure in the history of the League of Nations, allowing Italy to just steamroll into Ethiopia and take it over. Over in Asia, Japan is a model of that militarist ideal that we talked about before World War I. After World War I, Japan is building up their army and their navy. They're ignoring those treaties that they signed, in part with the United States in the 1920s. And in 1937, they invade mainland China. Actually, they had been asserting their influence in Manchuria as early as 1931. And this is an important area for resources, and the Japanese military will come to dominate this part of China. Japan is also going to pull out of the League of Nations. And Japan continues to take over other countries and territories in Asia, eventually growing an Asian empire of their own. And remember, at this time, the League of Nations, without the United States in it, is too weak to do anything about Japan. When Germany pulls out and starts rebuilding the German military, putting troops in the Rhineland, on the border of France, all of these things against the Treaty of Versailles, the League is too weak to do anything about Germany. When Italy takes over Ethiopia, the League is too weak to do anything about Italy's aggression. And Germany and Italy even help remove democracy in Spain and install a fascist dictator who's friendly to them in Spain. In 1936, Germany and Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact. It's an anti-communist alliance between Japan and Germany. Italy and other fascist countries will join later. But basically, this creates the Axis powers, the alliance that Hitler and the Japanese military will use in World War II. The United States is the only country that could have led the opposition to such an action. But the United States refused to do so. Let's take a look at why. Why no U.S. response? Well, a big reason is the Great Depression. The Great Depression causes Americans to ignore foreign policy and what's going on in other parts of the world and really focus on trying to survive here at home. The idea of thinking about other countries' problems during the Great Depression is foreign to many Americans during the Great Depression. Also, in the time after World War I, there's been a lot of thinking and a lot of writing and a lot of scholarly study of World War I. And really, many scholars and writers and thinkers have come to the conclusion that all war is bad. World War I was the worst of war. And books like All Quiet on the Western Front and Goodbye to All That really emphasize the futility and the needless bloodshed and the craziness of war. And historians in the time after World War I have become strongly critical of Woodrow Wilson. On college campus, there are youth protests, particularly at Brown and Princeton University. College students form a group known as the Veterans of Future Wars. Pretty clever name. They walk out of class in support of the anti-war movement. And this is students joined by their professors at times. The pacifism movement is growing in America after World War I. There are calls to abolish the Reserve Officer Training Corps, the ROTC, that exists on many college campuses. There are calls to cut military spending. And there are petitions signed to not support any war effort in the future. Congress even convenes a congressional investigation known as the Nye Committee, headed by this man, Republican from North Dakota, Senator Gerald Nye. And what the Nye Committee realizes or uncovers is that DuPont and other arms manufacturers in the United States enjoyed enormous profits during World War I. He's doing this investigation during the Great Depression. So people were already angry at businessmen as a result of that. And now Americans are learning that bankers and arms makers were the reason that we went to war in 1917. At least that's what's commonly believed by many people in the 1930s. On top of this, Franklin Roosevelt's election shifted foreign policy. He begins what's known as the good neighbor policy. This is a reversal from the Roosevelt corollary and acting as the police officer of the Western Hemisphere. FDR states that no country has the right to interfere in another country. This means no more American imperialism. He is opposed to aggression. This means that we're not going to intervene in Latin America nearly as much anymore. It also leads to an increase in overall isolationism. And in 1935, Congress puts this isolationism into law with the Neutrality Acts. In 1935, Congress signs a law or passes a law that says American companies cannot sell arms, cannot sell weapons to nations at war. And U.S. citizens are encouraged to not travel on ships of nations that are at war. Remember the Lusitania? We want to avoid another situation like that. In 1936, Congress passes a law that bans American banks or anyone from giving loans to nations at war. And in 1937, a law is passed that says that all trade, remember you can't sell arms to nations at war, but if you're going to trade anything with countries that are at war, you have to do it on what's called a cash and carry basis, which means we're not going to accept credit. And those other countries have to ship the goods themselves. That's going to prevent American merchant ships from getting into harm's way, and it's going to avoid the situation where cargo might be sunk and American businesses had yet to be paid. However, FDR is not entirely neutral. Yes, he's trying to continue the New Deal. And yes, he reads the nation's public opinion and that the public supports neutrality, but he is not entirely isolationist. For example, FDR allowed China to continue to buy arms from America to oppose Japanese aggression. And when Democratic House Representative Lewis Ludlow proposed a constitutional amendment changing the Constitution to require in the future a national referendum to go to war. In other words, Ludlow wanted to make a law that said that if the country wants to go to war, if Congress wants to declare war, we have to have a national vote on it, and more than half of the country has to say yes. This almost passed Congress, and it probably would have passed Congress and been sent to the states for ratification. And who knows if it would have been ratified, but FDR urged people in Congress, especially his Democrats, to vote down the national referendum constitutional amendment. And so that's blocked. This allows Roosevelt and the federal government in the future to declare war without as much public support. You're going to read about other things that the United States does which really skirt the line of neutrality leading up to Pearl Harbor.